Hello everyone. Tonight we are going to talk about something quite dark. We will explore the story of a silent killer that spread around the world just over 100 years ago, the 1918 flu. If you think you know what a pandemic is because of what we recently went through, forget all of that. This was not breaking news on your phone. This was not working from home. It was a worldwide disaster during a time when there were no antibiotics, no breathing machines, and when medical science was just starting to understand what it was fighting. Being a regular person in 1918 was not like looking at an old, peaceful photograph from the past. It was honestly terrifying. Tonight you are not just watching a documentary. You are imagining yourself in a world where a simple sneeze from a stranger on the streetcar could mean death in less than 48 hours. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this story and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from all around the world. Now turn down the lights and let us begin tonight's journey together. In the cold, still air of January 1918, in a forgotten corner of Kansas called Haskell County, where the world seemed to be only flat land and the constant sound of wind blowing across the prairie, a country doctor named Loring Minor began to notice something strange. Dr. Minor was a careful man who was used to the patterns of life and sickness in a farming community. He knew seasonal flu. He saw it every winter, normal and manageable. But this was different. People were getting sick very quickly. The illness was violent and brutal. It was a flu that hit with the force of a punch, leaving strong, healthy men unable to get out of bed within hours, with high fevers and body aches that felt like they could break bones. Minor, worried, watched as this unusually harsh sickness spread through his small community from farm to farm. He noticed its strange preference for the young and healthy, those who would normally shake off a common cold easily. He saw how some developed serious pneumonia that killed them in just a couple of days. This was not normal. It was such an unusual problem that he decided to do something few country doctors did at the time. He wrote to the Journal of the United States Public Health Service, warning about an epidemic of very severe flu. His letter was published and then ignored. The world had more important things to worry about. The Great War was happening in Europe, and the American war effort was speeding up to full power. Haskell County, like so many other places in rural America, was sending its young men to war. Young farm boys, used to the open air and the quiet life of the fields, said goodbye to their families and went to the training camps. One of these centers, a huge military complex that had appeared from nothing on the Kansas plains, was Camp Funston, part of Fort Riley. In late February, several young men from Haskell, probably carrying the virus without showing symptoms or already recovered from that strange flu, arrived at the camp to begin their training. They brought with them more than just their few belongings and their dreams of glory in France. They brought the virus. Camp Funston was basically a temporary city designed to train soldiers on a large scale. More than 50,000 men lived crowded together in cold wooden barracks designed to hold far fewer people. They slept in bunks so close together that a man could reach out his arm and touch the person next to him. The air inside was a thick mix of smoke from coal stoves, sweat, human breath, and the fine dust from the Kansas plains that came in through every crack. To make things worse, the winter of 1918 had been especially harsh. The soldiers kept the windows and doors of the barracks tightly closed to stay warm from the bone-chilling cold. Without meaning to, they had created the perfect place for a breathing disease to spread. And then there was the animal waste. Thousands of horses and mules needed for the army's supplies produced tons of manure every day. To get rid of it, the army burned it in huge fires that blazed day and night, filling the air with thick, harsh smoke that hurt the lungs and made eyes water. In this place of overcrowding, poor airflow, and constant lung irritation, the virus from Haskell County did not just find a home, it found paradise. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, a company cook named Albert Gitchell went to the camp hospital. He complained of a headache, fever, and sore throat, a normal case of flu. Nothing to worry about. The doctor checked his temperature and told him to rest in bed. Gitchell is often mentioned, though incorrectly, as patient zero of the pandemic. He was not, of course. The virus had already been spreading quietly for weeks. But he was the first official recorded case in the place that would become the first major spreader of the disease. By noon that same day, more than 100 soldiers had followed Gitchell to the hospital with the same symptoms. By the end of the week, there were more than 500. The camp hospital, with its limited space, was completely overwhelmed. They had to set up emergency hospitals in hangars and other large buildings. filling them with endless rows of beds. The doctors and nurses, outnumbered and without enough supplies, could do little more than offer basic care and wait. The size of the outbreak was shocking, but the war had its own urgent needs. The United States Army followed a strict rule. The flow of men to the war front could not be stopped for anything. A flu outbreak, no matter how serious it seemed, was an inconvenience, not an obstacle. And so while thousands of men got sick at Camp Funston, tens of thousands of others, healthy but possibly infected, continued their journey. They got on crowded trains that took them to other camps across the entire United States, spreading the virus at every stop. Camps in Georgia, Virginia, and Massachusetts. Within a month, 24 of the country's 36 largest military camps were dealing with major outbreaks. From those camps, the next stage of the journey was the East Coast to the shipping ports like Newport News and New York City. There, the soldiers were packed onto troop ships, huge vessels like the USS Leviathan, a former German ocean liner that had been captured, which could carry more than 10,000 men on a single trip. The conditions on these ships were even worse than in the camps. The men slept in hammocks hung in rows so close that their breaths mixed together in a shared cloud. The air on the lower decks was foul and stale. They were floating germ factories speeding across the Atlantic. And so the virus, born in the stillness of a Kansas farm and strengthened in the harsh conditions of a military camp, went to sea. The First World War, with its endless need for men and its extraordinary worldwide supply network, had accidentally become the most efficient delivery system a pandemic could ever hope for. The American soldiers, the famous doughboys, were not just carrying rifles and hope to the trenches of Europe. They were carrying with them the seeds of a plague that would make the deaths from the war itself seem almost small by comparison. The harsh conditions of war had created a biological weapon, and now it was being sent to every battlefront. When the American troop ships arrived at French ports in the spring of 1918, like Brest and Bordeaux, the virus got off the ships with them and it began to spread. It moved with quiet efficiency, first among the Allied soldiers on the Western Front, and then jumping across the battle lines to infect German soldiers. Soon, it spread from the armies into the civilian populations of France, Great Britain, Italy, and Germany. But this first appearance of the disease, what we now know as the first wave, was strangely misleading. It was definitely very contagious. It spread like wildfire in the cities and towns, but its deadliness was relatively low. The symptoms were those of a severe but familiar flu. 3 or 4 days of high fever, muscle aches, a cough, and deep tiredness. People called it the 3-day fever or the Flanders fever. Most of those who caught it, though they felt very ill, made a full recovery within a week. The death rate, though slightly higher than a normal seasonal flu, was not alarming. It seemed to be just that, a bad flu, a nuisance in the middle of a world war. The authorities, both military and civilian, paid it little attention. In a world where daily headlines talked about hundreds of thousands killed in military battles, a flu outbreak that killed a few did not seem like a priority. Wartime censorship also played an important role in this false sense of safety. The fighting nations like Germany, France, Great Britain, and the United States strictly suppressed any news of the disease in their countries. Admitting that their armies and factory workers were being destroyed by flu would have been a disaster for morale and a propaganda gift to the enemy. So quite simply, it was not talked about. The newspapers were filled with reports of victories and heroic acts, not of soldiers lying in bed with a fever. It was this censorship that gave the pandemic its misleading and lasting name, the Spanish flu. Spain was neutral in the First World War, and therefore its newspapers were not under military censorship. When the flu arrived in Madrid in May of 1918, the newspapers reported on it freely. They wrote about the large number of sick people in the capital, about how public services were being affected. They even reported that King Alfonso XIII had become very ill. Since the news about the epidemic seemed to be coming only from Spain, the rest of the world assumed it had started there. It was a classic case of blaming the messenger. The Spanish, somewhat angry, called it the Naples soldier, after a popular musical that was playing in Madrid at the time, as catchy and quick to spread as the disease itself. But the name Spanish flu stuck, an unfair label that hid its probable origins on the American plains. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1918, this first wave swept across the globe. It followed the trade and military routes, reaching Africa, India, and Asia. Everywhere, the story was the same: an incredibly contagious disease that rarely killed. People got used to it. It was a nuisance, an interruption to daily life and the war effort, but not a deadly threat. Doctors, basing their expectations on their experience with other flu pandemics like the one in 1889, expected the virus would simply run its course and disappear, getting weaker with each new spread. They believed the worst was over. They were wrong, terribly wrong. The virus was not disappearing. It was learning. It was spreading, changing, and waiting. The seeming gentleness of the first wave was not an act of nature's kindness. It was a preview, a trick. It was making the world feel safe, creating worldwide overconfidence that would make the next act all the more terrible. The spring wave was the quiet swell that comes before the tsunami, a warning that almost no one knew how to hear or wanted to hear. The real monster was forming in silence, in the most chaotic and crowded place on the planet at that moment, the ports and temporary camps of northern France. The summer of 1918 brought a misleading calm in many parts of the northern hemisphere. The first wave of the flu seemed to fade with the arrival of warmer weather. Cases went down, and the world breathed a shared sigh of relief. Attention returned entirely to the war, which was entering its final phase. The great German spring attacks had failed, and now the Allies, strengthened by a continuous flow of American troops, were preparing the counterattack that would finally bring the war to an end. The ports of France, especially Brest and Brittany, became the busiest and most frantic places on Earth. Brest was a gigantic human funnel. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers got off ships there each month, only to be sent to temporary camps before heading to the front. At the same time, thousands of veteran soldiers, wounded or on rotation, passed through in the opposite direction. It was a meeting point, a biological mixing pot, where people from all over the world came together. Soldiers from every state in America, colonial workers from Indochina, Senegal, and Algeria, alongside British, Canadian, Australian, and French troops. Each of them carried with them their own germs, their own history of being exposed to different types of viruses and bacteria. In this overcrowded and stressed environment, with men weakened by travel, exhaustion, and poor food, the flu virus found an unprecedented laboratory for change. It was not a single change in a single place, but a continuous process of selection and adaptation. The virus, which is basically a packet of genetic material with an amazing ability to make copying mistakes, made copies of itself billions of times in the bodies of these soldiers. Most of these changes were useless or even harmful to the virus itself, but every so often, one would appear that gave it an advantage. In the summer of 1918, somewhere in this pot of genetic mixing, a new version appeared. It could have been in Brest or in a nearby temporary camp like Etaples, a notoriously massive British troop station that also suffered a strange outbreak of a breathing illness in 1916. No one knows the exact moment or the exact place, but what we do know is that the virus changed. It went through what virus scientists call an antigenic shift. To put it very simply, the virus changed its outer appearance so much that the human immune system, which had learned to recognize and fight the spring version, no longer recognized it at all. It was for all practical purposes a new virus, and it was infinitely more deadly. This new strain was not content to cause a 3-day fever. It attacked the lungs with unheard of violence. It learned to go deep into the lung tissue, destroying cells and causing massive bleeding. But its most terrible weapon was its ability to manipulate the victim's own immune system and turn it against itself. Especially in the young and healthy, whose immune systems were at their peak, the virus triggered an out-of-control response known as a cytokine storm. Cytokines are proteins that the immune system uses to send signals and organize the body's defense. In a normal response, they are essential. But in this case, the virus caused the body to release a massive, chaotic flood of these proteins into the lungs. Instead of an organized defense, it was an uncontrolled artillery attack. The body's own white blood cells and fluids would flood the lungs in a desperate attempt to destroy the invader. But in the process, they destroyed the delicate lung tissue. The infected person basically drowned in their own fluids. This was the tragic irony of the new strain. The strongest, those with the most powerful defenses, were the most vulnerable. Their own strength became their death sentence. The symptoms of this new version of the flu were terrifying and fast. A person could feel perfectly healthy in the morning, develop a fever and flu-like symptoms by noon, and be dead by nightfall. The most distinctive feature was heliotrope cyanosis, a bluish or purplish color that appeared on the face, especially around the lips and ears. It was the visible sign of a lack of oxygen in the blood. the signal that the lungs were failing terribly. Doctors who saw it for the first time often thought they were treating plague or cholera, not flu. They had never seen the flu do anything like it. By the end of August 1918, this new and monstrous version of the virus was ready to be unleashed upon the world. And once again, the machinery of war would provide the transportation system. It began to spread from the ports of France in 3 directions at the same time. To the east, with troops heading to the front, causing destruction on both sides of the trenches. To the south, through France and into the rest of Europe and North Africa. And most ominously of all, to the west, ships that had transported troops to Europe now prepared for the return journey to the United States, to Great Britain, to Canada. Some carried the wounded, others carried personnel on rotation, and still others were simply returning empty of men but full of cargo. And on many of those ships, the new strain of the virus traveled as an invisible passenger. In August, outbreaks of this deadly and rapidly progressing flu appeared almost at the same time in 3 port cities, separated by thousands of miles. Freetown in Sierra Leone, a key port for the British Navy. Boston in the United States, a major naval port and troop entry point. And back in Brest, France, where it all likely began. The second wave, the death wave, had begun. The changed and perfected version of the virus, created in the chaos of war, was now loose. The false safety of the summer was about to be shattered, and the world was about to enter the 3 deadliest months in human history. The misleading wave of the spring had been merely the practice run. Now the curtain was rising on the main performance. The summer of 1918 was fading, and with it the memory of that strange yet relatively harmless illness of the spring. The war, the Great War, still raged, and its demands were complete. The world's attention was focused on the fields of Flanders and the forests of the Argonne. The 3-day fever, as many called it, seemed like a bad memory, a simple seasonal cold that had been slightly more annoying than usual. But beneath the surface, in the invisible world of the microscopic, the virus had not disappeared. It had been traveling, learning, changing. In the crowded barracks and in the bodies of millions of soldiers, it had found the perfect training ground. And in August, as the leaves were only just beginning to think of turning, the changed virus, now an infinitely more efficient killer, decided to make its return. It was not in a single place but in 3, almost at the same time. 3 ports, 3 festering wounds upon the map of the world, from which the infection would bleed outwards like an ink stain on blotting paper. The first was Brest in France, the main port where American troops got off ships. Fresh men, full of energy and patriotism, arrived by the thousands each day, ready to tip the scales of the war, and in the ships that brought them, in their very lungs, the new virus was growing. The second was Boston, Massachusetts, at its Commonwealth Pier. A ship from Europe docked, and the sailors sick, scattered throughout the city. The third centre was Freetown in Sierra Leone, a vital port for the British Navy in West Africa. A ship, the HMS Mantua, arrived with sick crewmen, and the disease jumped ashore with the ease of a spark in a haystack. Brest, Boston, and Freetown, 3 port cities, now the starting points for an invasion far deadlier than any the generals had ever imagined. This was not the flu of the springtime. That had been a practice run. This was the main event. The disease that appeared in late August was something terrifying and new. The time between catching it and getting sick was dizzyingly short, sometimes only a few hours. A man could feel perfectly healthy at breakfast and be stuck in bed with a very high fever by lunchtime. The first symptoms were familiar: fever, headache, terrible muscle aches. But then the illness would take a dark turn. The patient's lungs would begin to fail. The cough, at first dry, became wet and productive, and the sick would cough up frothy mucus, often mixed with blood. Breathing became fast and shallow, a desperate struggle for oxygen that the body could no longer process. And then came the most distinctive and terrifying sign of the second wave: cyanosis. As the lungs filled with a bloody fluid and became useless, oxygen levels in the blood would drop. The patient's skin would begin to change colour. This was not the paleness of common illness. It was a dark, ghastly colour. It would start at the extremities, the fingertips, the earlobes, a delicate bluish tint like watered-down ink. Then it would spread, creeping up the arms and legs, staining the face. The skin would turn a deep purple, sometimes almost black. The doctors of the time searching for a medical description for something that seemed torn from a dark nightmare, called it heliotrope cyanosis, named for the color of the heliotrope flower. It was a poetic description for a horrible process. To watch a loved one turn blue before your eyes was to watch death happen in real time. Patients became so dark that it was often difficult to tell white soldiers from black soldiers. One doctor wrote with a chilling calmness that he could only identify the race of his dead patients by looking at the soles of their feet. This purple death, as the newspapers called it, was incredibly fast. The pneumonia that developed was more violent than ever seen before. It was not a lobar pneumonia, which affected one section of a lung. It was a massive bleeding pneumonia, which turned both lungs into a heavy, waterlogged, airless mass similar to a liver. Autopsies revealed lungs that weighed 2 or 3 times their normal weight, soaked with a red, frothy liquid. The victims were quite literally drowning in their own bodily fluids, suffocating on dry land in their hospital beds or their homes. It was common for a young soldier in the prime of his life to be admitted to the hospital in the morning and sent to the morgue by nightfall. The disease showed a twisted preference for the young and healthy, those between 20 and 40 years old. Their immune systems, strong and aggressive, overreacted to the virus, unleashing what we now know as a cytokine storm. Their own strength became their weakness. The body's defense system, in its panic to fight the invader, flooded the lungs with cells and fluids, destroying the very tissue it was trying to protect. The body declared war on itself, and the battlefield was the lungs. It was a brutal and swift civil war, from which few came out alive. The autumn of 1918 became a season of terror. The war, which had been the center of existence for 4 long years, suddenly had competition. An anonymous, impersonal purple death was sweeping across the world, and it was doing so using the very infrastructure men had built to destroy one another. The engine of the war became, ironically, the engine of the pandemic. The spread of this new and lethal strain was a masterpiece of efficiency, an accidental proof of the global connectedness the war had created. The world at the beginning of the 20th century had become smaller than ever. Steamships crossed oceans in days, not months. Railway networks spread like spiderwebs across continents. And in 1918, all of this infrastructure was dedicated to a single purpose, moving men and material for the war effort. The virus simply climbed aboard. Troop ships were the main cross-ocean carriers. Imagine a vessel like the USS Leviathan, a former German ocean liner converted into a troop transport. It could carry over 10,000 soldiers at a time, packed into bunks stacked from the bottom to the deck. Ventilation was poor. The air was a thick soup of breath, sweat, and now billions of viral particles. They were perfect floating incubators. A single infected soldier getting on board in New York could mean hundreds of cases by mid-Atlantic and thousands upon arrival in Brest. A voyage that began with young men singing and full of excitement could end with hundreds of men too sick to walk, getting off the ship, and the unloading of dozens of canvas-wrapped corpses. In September of 1918, one convoy carrying 20,000 soldiers from the United States to France recorded over 2,000 deaths during the crossing alone. The ships earned the nickname floating coffins. The ocean became a vast anonymous graveyard. Once the ships reached port, the virus got off with the troops. From Brest, infected soldiers, often still not showing symptoms, were loaded onto trains and sent to the front. Every stop along the way, every train station in a small French village, was a new opportunity for the virus to spill over into the local population. From Freetown, British Royal Navy ships carried the disease to other African ports, and from there it moved inland, following trade routes and colonial railway lines. The pandemic swept through Africa with terrifying speed and violence, destroying populations that had no prior immunity and whose health systems were basic or non-existent. In the United States, the pattern was identical. From the starting point, in Boston at Camp Devens, a massive army training camp, the virus exploded. On a single day in September, 1,543 cases were reported at the camp. Troop trains leaving Devon's and other East Coast camps carried the disease inland, following the main railway lines. The flu travelled from east to west in a matter of weeks, from Boston to Chicago, from Chicago to Kansas City, from Kansas City to San Francisco. It was an unstoppable wave moving at the speed of a train. Philadelphia held a massive parade to promote war bonds in late September, ignoring the warnings of doctors. Hundreds of thousands of people crowded the streets. 2 days later, the city's hospitals were overflowing. Within a week, thousands were dead. The city literally ran out of coffins. The virus respected no borders, no battle lines. On the Western Front, it spread like wildfire through the trenches. Germans, French, British, and Americans fell alike. Some historians argue that the final German attack in the spring of 1918 stalled not only because of Allied resistance, but because their assault troops were weakened and destroyed by the first wave of flu. The second wave was even worse. General Erich Ludendorff, the mastermind of the German war effort, complained that the flu was a major factor in the low morale and inability of his troops to resist the final Allied attack. The pandemic chose no side. It simply weakened all equally, speeding up the end of an already exhausting war. In a matter of 3 months, from September to November of 1918, the virus had reached every inhabited continent. It travelled on ships to South Africa, where it killed hundreds of thousands in a matter of weeks. It reached India, where the final death toll would be counted in the millions, perhaps as high as 5% of the subcontinent's entire population. It arrived in Australia on returning troop ships, forcing the country to put in place strict quarantines. It even reached the most remote islands of the Pacific. In Western Samoa, a single ship from New Zealand, the SS Talloon, brought the disease. Within 2 months, 22% of the island's population was dead. The virus had gone global, using the arteries of empire and war as its personal highway system. The entire world had become an interconnected trap. There was nowhere to run. The disease that had begun quietly somewhere in the world was now everywhere, and humanity faced an enemy it could not see, fight, or negotiate with. And in the trenches of this new war, doctors and nurses were about to find out just how defenseless they truly were. As the pandemic spread with dizzying speed, the world of medicine found itself in a state of almost total helplessness. The doctors and scientists of 1918, proud of the advances of the past few decades in studying bacteria and public health, faced an enemy that went against all their understanding. They were fighting a war in the dark, in makeshift medical trenches, against an invisible and ruthless enemy. The first and most basic problem was that they did not know what caused the disease. The germ theory of Pasteur and Koch was the main medical belief, and the search focused on finding a bacterial cause. The prime suspect was a bacteria discovered by Richard Pfeiffer in 1892, named Haemophilus influenzae. This was believed to be the bacteria responsible for flu. Teams of the world's best bacteria scientists, from the Rockefeller Institute in New York to the Pasteur Institute in Paris, worked frantically to find Pfeiffer's bacteria in patients. Sometimes they found it, sometimes they did not. They tried to create vaccines from cultures of this and other bacteria found in the victims. These hastily developed and distributed vaccines were at best useless against the flu itself, though they may have offered some protection against secondary bacterial pneumonia. The truth, of course, was that the cause was not a bacteria at all. It was a virus, a biological thing so small it could not be seen with the microscopes of the time. They were hunting for an elephant while being trampled by a colony of invisible ants. Lacking a known cause and a specific cure, doctors fell back on what they had: symptom-treating medicine, and a range of treatments that went from well-meaning but useless to outright dangerous. Fevers were fought with cool baths and aspirin. In fact, aspirin, a relatively new and praised wonder drug, was prescribed in massive doses. The Surgeon General of the United States went so far as to recommend up to 30 grams a day, an amount we now know is toxic and can cause fluid in the lungs. It is a grim irony that some of the standard treatment of the day may have contributed to the high death rate, making worse the very symptom that made the flu so lethal. Other remedies were a catalogue of the era's medicines. Quinine, the treatment for malaria, was given. Strychnine was used as a stimulant. Arsenic and mercury compounds were used in a desperate attempt to kill the unknown germ. Ancient practices like bloodletting were brought back, further weakening patients already fighting for their lives. Camphor oil was injected to stimulate the heart. None of it worked. Doctors watched in despair as their patients turned purple and choked to death, having exhausted their arsenal of useless remedies. Perhaps the greatest obstacle was the lack of treatment for complications. Most deaths from the 1918 flu were not caused directly by the virus, but by secondary bacterial pneumonia. The virus acted like a battering ram, shattering the natural defenses of the lungs. Once the walls were broken, common bacteria like Streptococcus and Staphylococcus, which normally lived harmlessly in the throat, would invade the damaged lung tissue. It was a perfect storm of viral and bacterial infection. And in 1918, there were no antibiotics. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin was still a decade away, and its medical use more than 2 decades away. With no weapons to fight these secondary bacterial infections, doctors could only offer supportive care, keeping the patient hydrated, warm, and comfortable, and hoping that their own body could somehow win the battle. More often than not, it could not. As the number of sick soared, health systems around the world collapsed under the pressure. Hospitals were filled beyond capacity in a matter of days. Emergency spaces were set up in schools, churches, city halls, and military armories. Tent cities were built in public parks to house the sick. But it was not just a matter of space. There was a shortage of staff. Doctors and nurses, working 18-hour shifts surrounded by death and disease, got sick themselves at an alarming rate. In many cities, half of the medical staff was out of service. 3rd and 4th year medical students were pulled from their classes and put on the wards, learning on the job. A desperate call went out for volunteers, for anyone willing to risk their life to care for the sick. Nurses in particular became the unsung heroes of the pandemic, offering comfort and basic care when medicine had failed. They faced apocalyptic scenes, wards with hundreds of men coughing up blood, hallways lined with stretchers, and a constant line to the morgue. The collapse was not limited to hospitals. The entire infrastructure of life and death broke down. Funeral homes ran out of space and staff. Coffin makers could not keep up with demand. In Philadelphia, bodies piled up in homes for days because there was no one to collect them. Steam shovels and horse-drawn carts were used to pick up the dead from the sidewalks. Mass graves were dug because gravediggers were sick or dead, or simply could not dig individual graves fast enough. Telephone lines collapsed because the operators were sick. Garbage collection stopped. Farms went without workers to harvest the crops. The very fabric of society began to fall apart. In the midst of this chaos, figures like William H. Welch of Johns Hopkins Hospital and the team at the Rockefeller Institute fought desperately for a scientific answer. They saw themselves as soldiers in a different war, a war against ignorance and disease. But every bacterial culture that came back negative, every experimental vaccine that failed, was a fresh defeat. The sense of powerlessness was overwhelming. They had gone from the confidence of the golden age of studying bacteria to the humbling, terrifying realization that they were facing something entirely beyond their understanding. Humanity, at the peak of its industrial and military power, was brought to its knees by something so small that no one could see it. The autumn of 1918 was a long and bleak proof of the limits of human knowledge, a season in which the only truly effective treatments were rest, fresh air, the gentle care of a nurse, and an enormous amount of luck. And then the world began to close, not with the slam of a door, but with the quiet whisper of a door being eased shut, its latch clicking softly into place. Public health authorities, armed with often conflicting theories and a barely hidden panic, began to pull the levers of society one by one, hoping that one of them would stop the invisible machine of death. The first and most obvious lever was that of leisure. The places where people gathered to forget their troubles suddenly became the very centers of the problem. Movie houses, vaudeville theaters, dance halls, skating rinks, places of laughter and courtship fell silent. The neon lights flickered and went dark. Posters announcing the new stars of the silver screen, like Mary Pickford or Charlie Chaplin, were left to fade beneath a sun no one would see from a theater seat. In cities like Chicago and New York, the closure orders came in stages, almost timidly. First, perhaps a suggestion to avoid crowds, then a ban on indoor performances. Finally, a total shutdown. Theater owners protested, of course. They spoke of economic ruin, of public morale, of the right to gather, but their arguments were drowned out by the sound of coughs echoing in the streets. After the theaters came the schools. Closing the schools seemed a logical step. Children, those little carriers of disease, moved in groups, sharing inkwells, secrets, and now a lethal virus. Thousands of schools across the United States shut their doors. Playgrounds, once filled with shouts and games, became strangely quiet, inhabited only by the wind that swayed the empty swings. But even this measure was not accepted by everyone. In New York, Health Commissioner Dr. Royal Copeland argued against closing the schools. His logic was curious but not entirely without merit. He said that many children from the city's poor neighborhoods were better off in school under the supervision of nurses who could spot the first symptoms than in their overcrowded and unsanitary tenements. For them, school was a refuge, not a breeding ground for infection. It was a debate with no easy answer, one of the many moral and practical crossroads the pandemic presented daily. Then the churches closed. This was perhaps the most difficult measure for many to accept. At a time of fear and death, when people most sought the comfort of faith and community, they were denied access to their places of worship. On Sunday mornings, the bells fell silent in many cities, not always by order, but sometimes simply because there were not enough healthy churchgoers to fill the pews, or because the priest himself lay sick in his bed. Public funerals were forbidden. Flu victims were buried hastily, often in private ceremonies with only a handful of masked mourners keeping an uncomfortable distance. Death became an administrative matter, stripped of its comforting rituals. Weddings were forbidden. Baptisms were cancelled. Life, in its most sacred moments, was put on hold. The streets, the beating heart of urban life, began to empty. Quarantine rules grew increasingly strict. In some cities, coloured signs were posted on the doors of infected homes. A yellow sign, a blue sign, a red sign, each showing the presence of flu, pneumonia, or both. They were marks of shame, warnings for neighbours, the milkman, the postman, to stay away. The community broke into isolated units. People peeked from behind curtains, suspiciously watching anyone who coughed on the sidewalk. In San Francisco, an order was even issued that streetcars should not stop at their regular stops if they were already full, to avoid overcrowding. The result was that streetcars simply rolled past, leaving crowds of frustrated, masked workers on the corners. And then there were the masks. The gauze face mask became the defining symbol of the pandemic. They were flimsy pieces of cloth, often homemade, of highly questionable effectiveness. But their use was a massive act of public psychology. Wearing a mask was not just a protective measure, but a statement of civic duty, a sign that one was doing their part. In cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver, laws were passed making masks mandatory in public. Police fined the slackers, those who dared to show their bare faces. Newspapers published photos of masked crowds, masked policemen, masked judges presiding over masked courtrooms. Mask courts were set up to prosecute offenders. It was a surreal vision, a macabre citywide masquerade. Of course, there was resistance. Anti-mask leagues were formed, arguing that the laws were a violation of personal freedom. They claimed the masks were ineffective, uncomfortable, and an overreach of government power. They were a vocal minority, but their protests were an early echo of debates that would be repeated in the future. The sum of all these measures transformed bustling cities into silent ghost towns. The roar of traffic was replaced by the echo of one's own footsteps. Commercial streets, once crowded, were now deserted, with shops closed and display windows empty. The air, normally thick with the smell of coal, horses and street food, now smelled of disinfectants, of phenol and formaldehyde. At night, the darkness was deeper. With theatres and halls closed, the cities lost their nighttime glow. Only the lights of pharmacies remained on, solitary beacons in a sea of silence and fear. Daily life had been reduced to the essentials, getting food, avoiding contact, surviving. The world had become smaller, quieter, more frightening. And amid this global silence, a question began to float on the air, whispered down telegraph wires, and shouted in the headlines of the few uncensored newspapers. Where did this plague come from? The answer, or at least the one the world chose to adopt, would be as unfair as the virus itself. The name given to the pandemic, the one that has lasted in collective memory for over a century, was the Spanish flu. It is a catchy name, evocative and completely wrong. Spain was not the birthplace of the disease. It was no more to blame for its spread than any other country, and in fact suffered terribly from its effects. So why Spain? The answer has nothing to do with virus science, and everything to do with wartime propaganda and censorship. In the spring of 1918, the First World War was at its peak. The great powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side, France, Great Britain and the United States on the other were locked in a fight to the death. In this context, information was a weapon. Morale, both on the front lines and at home, was a strategic resource as valuable as ammunition or bread. And nothing hurts morale more than the news that your soldiers, in addition to facing machine guns and mustard gas, are being destroyed by a mysterious illness. Therefore, the fighting nations did what they do best in times of war. They controlled the story. In Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the press was under strict military censorship. Newspapers were forbidden to publish anything that could harm the war effort or lower the morale of the population. And a detailed report about a flu epidemic spreading like wildfire through military camps and industrial cities certainly fell into that category, so they did not publish it. Reports on the flu, when they did appear, were brief, vague, and reassuring. They spoke of a 3-day flu, a passing ailment. The true scale of the problem was deliberately hidden. Military doctors reported the alarming rate of sickness to their superiors, but those reports were classified as secret. The general public in Paris, London, or Berlin remained in blissful ignorance, at least at first. But there was one country in Western Europe that was not playing this game: Spain. Spain had remained neutral in the Great War, and as a neutral country, its press was not under wartime censorship. Spanish newspapers were free to report on what was happening within their borders. And in late May of 1918, something was happening. A strange wave of illness, remarkably fast and weakening, swept the country. It began in Madrid and spread rapidly. The capital's streetcars ran on reduced schedules because there were not enough healthy drivers. Government offices emptied. Even the king, Alfonso XIII, fell ill. And the Spanish newspapers, like ABC or El Sol, reported on it all. They published detailed articles about the symptoms, the number of people affected, the closure of universities and theatres. They did not do this because the flu was worse in Spain, but simply because they could. To the rest of the world, reading these reports through international news agencies, the impression was immediate and misleading. While their own newspapers remained silent, the reports coming from Spain painted an alarming picture of a nationwide epidemic. The flu seemed to be everywhere in Spain. It was a simple matter of information visibility. Spain was the only place where the disease was being openly documented, so logically the world assumed it had started there or was particularly violent in that country. Foreign reporters in Madrid began sending news about the Spanish flu. The name stuck. It was short, easy to remember, and it directed attention away from what was happening in the reader's own countries. For the Allied and Central Powers' high commands, it was a propaganda gift. They could refer to the disease as a foreign sickness, something that came from outside, rather than admitting it was thriving in their own barracks and factories. The nickname Spanish flu became a convenient smokescreen, an unintentional piece of misinformation that was burned into history. Spain protested, of course. Its diplomats and journalists pointed out that the disease was present elsewhere, including the French front, long before it reached Madrid. But their voices were lost in the roar of the war. The label, so unfair, had stuck. And so a pandemic that likely started in a military camp in Kansas, in the United States, or perhaps in a British field hospital in France, or even in China, would forever carry the name of an innocent nation that only had the misfortune of having a free press at the wrong time. The name was a lie, but the reach of the disease was a terrifying truth. This flu knew no borders, and its global journey was about to reach a devastating scale. The unfairness of its name was just a preview of the impartial cruelty of its reach. The virus did not look at maps or respect passports. It traveled in the lungs of soldiers crossing the Atlantic, in the train cars connecting cities, on the steamships that linked continents. Its spread was a grim proof of the new global connectedness that the industrial age had created. No place was safe, and nowhere was the disaster of the pandemic more dramatically shown than in the city of Philadelphia. In September 1918, Philadelphia was a hive of wartime activity. Its shipyards built vessels at a frantic pace, and its factories produced ammunition for the front. To fund this effort, the government promoted the sale of war bonds, the so-called Liberty Loans, through massive patriotic parades. The city's director of public health, Wilmer Cruzen, knew that the flu was already present in the region, especially at the nearby naval shipyard. Doctors warned him, begged him to cancel the Grand Liberty Loan Parade scheduled for September 28th. They argued that gathering hundreds of thousands of people in the streets would be like throwing gasoline on a smouldering fire. But Cruzen, under immense political and patriotic pressure, refused. He downplayed the fears, assured the public that the illness was just a common flu, and gave the parade the green light. It was one of the worst public health decisions in American history. 100,000 people packed Broad Street that day to see the floats, the marching bands, and the soldiers. They cheered, they sang, and they breathed the same virus-filled air. It was the perfect superspreader event. 72 hours later, all hell broke loose. Philadelphia's hospitals were swamped by a tidal wave of the sick. Cases were counted in the thousands, then in the tens of thousands. The city did not have enough doctors or nurses or hospital beds. The sick died in their homes, in hospital hallways, on the sidewalks. And then the second problem began: what to do with the dead. Funeral homes ran out of coffins. Carpenters worked day and night, but could not meet the demand. Desperate families left the bodies of their loved ones on their porches, wrapped in sheets. Death carts, often simple horse-drawn wagons, roamed the streets as drivers called out, "Bring out your dead." Corpses piled up in makeshift morgues, in ice houses, in any cold place available. The stench of death hung over the city. Finally, in a scene from a medieval nightmare, authorities had to use steam shovels to dig mass graves in the cemeteries. Philadelphia lost more than 12,000 people in a matter of weeks. The parade meant to celebrate liberty became a funeral procession for an entire city. The tragedy of Philadelphia was an urban disaster magnified by population density and one fatal decision. But the virus was just as devastating, if not more so, in the most remote and isolated places on the planet. Far from the big cities, in communities where people had never been exposed to common strains of flu, the virus acted with even greater violence. Immunity was non-existent. Take the case of the Inuit villages along the coast of Alaska and Labrador. These communities lived in near total isolation for much of the year. Their contact with the outside world was limited to the annual visit of supply ships. In the fall of 1918, those ships brought not only flour, ammunition, and news, but also the virus. In the village of Okak, Labrador, the steamship SS Harmony arrived in early October. A few days after it left, almost the entire village population fell ill. There were no doctors, no medicine. People died so quickly that there was no one healthy left to care for the sick, or to light the fires, or to hunt. Entire families froze or starved to death in their igloos. Out of a population of 266, 204 died. Okak became a ghost town, a frozen tomb. A similar story repeated itself in Alaska. On the Seward Peninsula, the Inupiaq village of Brevig Mission lost 72 of its 80 people over a span of 5 days in November 1918. The virus arrived with a mail carrier on a dog sled. The violence was such that the survivors, mostly orphan children, could only dig a mass grave in the frozen permafrost using steam jets and bury their families in an anonymous mass. Decades later, in the 1990s, scientists would dig up some of those bodies from the Brevig Mission grave in the hope of recovering samples of the virus and reading its genetic code. The frozen tragedy of that remote village held, ironically, the key to understanding the killer that had destroyed it. Perhaps the clearest and cruelest example of the pandemic's global reach and the crucial role of human decisions can be found in the South Pacific, on the islands of Samoa. In 1918, the Samoan archipelago was divided. Western Samoa was under the control of New Zealand, while American Samoa was a United States territory. Both were on the route of the steamship Talon, which sailed from Auckland in October 1918. On board the Talon were passengers with flu. Its first stop was Western Samoa. Despite the illness being obvious on board, the New Zealand authorities allowed the ship to dock and the passengers to get off without putting in place any quarantine. The result was apocalyptic. The virus tore through the island like a wildfire. The Samoan population had no prior immunity. Within 2 months, 22% of the population of Western Samoa, more than 8,500 people, was dead. Entire villages were wiped out. The social fabric fell apart. It was one of the highest death rates recorded anywhere in the world. Just 70 kilometers away in American Samoa, the story was completely different. The island's governor, US Navy Commander John Martin Poyer, had heard about the epidemic destroying the world via naval radio. When the Talon arrived in his port, Poyer, acting against the advice of local merchants who were worried about the economy, made a drastic decision. He forbade the ship from docking. He put in place a strict and complete naval quarantine around the island. No ships could enter or leave. He completely isolated his population from the rest of the world. The businessman complained bitterly. The New Zealand government protested, but Poyer stood firm, and his decision saved his people. Thanks to his quarantine, American Samoa did not record a single death from the 1918 flu. It is one of public health's most remarkable success stories. Two neighboring islands, the same people, the same virus. One was destroyed by carelessness, the other saved by foresight and decisive action. The tragedy of Western Samoa and the triumph of American Samoa show in the starkest possible way that while the virus was an agent of nature, the scale of the disaster was ultimately a human story. A story of decisions, good and bad, made in Philadelphia, in Wellington, and in the harbour of Pago Pago, that determined who would live and who would die in the greatest pandemic of modern history. And as the world counted its dead, a new question arose. What exactly was this thing? And what did it do to the human body to kill with such efficiency and speed? The answer lay in the lungs of the victims, a battlefield where a brutal war was being waged at a microscopic level. In the history of disease, there is a logic, cruel yet predictable. Plagues tend to hunt along the margins of life, taking the most vulnerable, the very young, whose immune systems are just starting out, and the very old, whose bodies are records of past winters. The death graph of a typical epidemic draws itself as a U, with peaks at both ends of the life spectrum. It is a pattern as ancient as illness itself, an unwritten rule of biology. And then, in the autumn of 1918, the flu decided to break that rule. It shattered it with a violence so bewildering that the doctors and scientists of the time could only stare at their own charts and graphs in a mixture of disbelief and terror. For the death curve of the Spanish flu was not a U, it was a W. It had the expected peaks in childhood and old age, yes. But in the centre, where there should have been a valley of survivors, rose a third spire, a monstrous and unnatural peak. This peak centred directly on the heart of society, adults between the ages of 20 and 40, the strongest, the healthiest, those in the prime of their lives. The flu was not just killing, it was cutting down a generation. In military camps, drill sergeants watched in horror as their most strong recruits, young men who could march 30 miles with a full pack, were the first to fall. They would collapse on the parade ground, going from radiant health to a delirious fever in a matter of hours, and were often dead within a day or two. In the munitions factories, the young women who had taken the place of men at the front, working 12-hour shifts to feed the war machine, were the ones filling the makeshift hospitals. In homes, young mothers, whose job it was to raise the next generation, died, leaving behind a trail of orphans the world was not prepared to receive. This phenomenon was the pandemic's most terrifying and bizarre feature. It went against all conventional medical wisdom. Why would a virus, seemingly designed to attack the lungs, prefer those whose lungs were strongest? The answer, which would only be fully understood decades later, was a biological paradox of exquisite cruelty. It was not the virus that was directly killing these healthy people. It was their own strength, their own perfectly tuned, vigorous immune systems were being turned into the murder weapon. The mechanism is known today as a cytokine storm. To understand it, one must imagine the immune system not as a simple shield, but as a complex and well-regulated army. When an invader like the flu virus enters the body, this army activates. It sends out chemical signals, cytokines, which are like battle orders. Send more white blood cells here. Increase inflammation to isolate the enemy. Raise the body temperature to cook the intruder. In a normal, balanced immune system, these orders are precise and proportional. The army fights the invader, wins the battle, and then stands down, allowing the body to repair the collateral damage. But the 1918 virus was an enemy the human immune system had never seen. It was a master of provocation. When it entered the lungs of a young, healthy adult, the immune system did not react with a measured response. It reacted with panic and overwhelming fury. Instead of sending out battle orders, the immune headquarters began screaming all orders at once. The cytokine storm was unleashed, a deafening flood of chemical signals that flooded the body, sending every available immune cell on a suicidal charge against the lungs. The battlefield was the delicate air sacs, the alveoli. In the rush to kill the virus, the immune army began to destroy the very ground it was meant to defend. Blood vessels became leaky, pouring fluid into the lungs. White blood cells piled up, releasing enzymes that dissolved lung tissue. Inflammation ran wild. In essence, the immune system was carrying out a scorched earth policy inside the body itself. The patient's lungs filled with a frothy, bloody mixture of fluid, dead cells, and viral debris. The victim was not dying so much from the flu as from drowning in their own bodily fluids. a death arranged by their own defense mechanism. This process explained the terrifying speed of the disease in the young. Their immune systems reacted faster and more forcefully, speeding up their own destruction. It also explained the most distinctive symptom of the fatal flu, heliotrope cyanosis. As the lungs became waterlogged, oxygen ceased to pass into the blood. The victim's skin would begin to take on a bluish or dark purple color, starting at the ears and spreading across the face. Veteran doctors knew that once this color appeared, an unsettling shade of the heliotrope flower, the end was near. It was the body's flag of surrender, the visible sign that the internal battle had been lost in the most catastrophic way imaginable. For the doctors of 1918, this was a hellish puzzle. Their usual treatments, designed to strengthen the body's defenses, often made things worse. They were unknowingly pouring gasoline on the fire of the cytokine storm. The very vigor that defined youth and health had become a death sentence. Nature had flipped its own rules. And the result was that the generation fighting the Great War found an even more relentless enemy in its own bloodstream, a traitor wearing the uniform of its own immune system. And as the scientists scratched their heads at this biological mystery, the virus, indifferent to their confusion, was already preparing for a final bitter act. By November of 1918, the world was on its knees. The second wave of the pandemic had swept across the planet with the fury of a wildfire, leaving a grief-laden silence in its wake. And then, just as it seemed the nightmare might be drawing to a close, came news that momentarily eclipsed the plague. At 11 a.m. on the 11th of November, in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, France, the armistice was signed. The Great War, the slaughter that had defined an era, was over. In the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Sydney, people poured into the streets. Bans on public gatherings, desperately put in place to slow the flu, were ignored. The collective joy was too powerful. Strangers hugged, soldiers danced with nurses, and the air filled with the sound of church bells and popping corks. For a moment, the world allowed itself to hope. They thought the twin nightmare of war and disease was over. But the virus does not respect peace treaties. As humanity celebrated, the 1918 H1N1 was regrouping for one last attack, a deadly echo that would prove that man's surrender on the battlefield meant nothing to biology. The third wave of the pandemic began to form in the winter of 1918 and stretched well into the spring and summer of 1919. It did not have the explosive speed or the absolute deadliness of the second wave. The virus, in its relentless process of adaptation, seemed to have slightly reduced its violence. Or perhaps the global population that had survived now had a degree of immunity, a cellular memory of the battle that gave them a fighting chance. But less lethal is a relative term. The third wave was still significantly deadlier than any known seasonal flu, and it struck a world that was already physically, emotionally, and economically shattered. It was like a boxer who, having knocked his opponent down, pulls him back up only to hit him one more time for good measure. The pattern of this third wave spread was closely tied to the end of the war. The mass demobilization of armies became its primary carrier. Millions of soldiers, crowded into trains and transport ships, began the long journey home, carrying with them not only their memories of the front, but also the latent virus. When they arrived in their cities and towns, they were greeted as heroes with parades and parties. Each of these welcome events, ironically, became a new breeding ground for infection. In some places, the third wave was the worst. Australia, an island nation that had managed to hold the second wave back with an extraordinarily strict sea quarantine, finally gave in. In January of 1919, the virus broke through the defences of Sydney and Melbourne and swept across the continent. For Australians, who had watched the disaster from a distance, the pandemic was just beginning, and it would end up costing some 15,000 lives. In Europe and North America, the wave was more of an aftershock than the main earthquake, but aftershocks kill too. Cities like San Francisco, which had prematurely lifted mask orders, had to grudgingly put them back in place as cases surged again. The public debate became bitter, with a weary population resisting the restrictions, a phenomenon that would later be called pandemic fatigue. Even the world's most powerful men were not immune. In April 1919, during the tense negotiations of the Paris Peace Conference, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, collapsed. He was officially diagnosed with a cold, but his symptoms, a sudden high fever, violent coughing, delirium, and the fact that several of his aides also fell ill, have led most historians to conclude that he caught the third wave flu. Wilson survived, but he was never the same. Those around him noted a change in his personality. He became more paranoid, stubborn, and inflexible, particularly in his negotiations with the French and British over the Treaty of Versailles. Some argue that the illness weakened his judgment, at a critical moment in history, contributing to the imposition of such punishing peace terms on Germany that they planted the seeds of the Second World War. The idea that a microscopic virus may have changed the geopolitical course of the 20th century is a sobering reflection on the fragility of human power. The third wave spread to the farthest corners of the globe, from the Pacific Islands to the Arctic, often aboard the same ships that carried the delayed news of the armistice. Finally, by mid-1919, the pandemic began to burn itself out. It did not disappear in a dramatic moment, but faded slowly, like the afterglow of a dying ember. The virus was not defeated. It simply ran out of a sufficient supply of non-immune hosts to sustain its explosive spread. It continued to circulate for years, but it changed into less deadly forms, integrating itself into the seasonal cycle of flu with which humanity would have to live. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of exhaustion. The world slowly got to its feet, blinking in the light of a new era. Factories reopened. Fields were ploughed once more. Soldiers tried to resume their lives, but everywhere there were gaps, empty chairs at the dinner table, faces missing from town photographs, names no longer answered at roll call. The war was over and the plague had faded. Only then, in the stillness of global recovery, did humanity begin the grim and near impossible task of counting its dead. The final accounting of a global disaster is never an exact science. It is a work of historical detective work, an assembling of fragments, an estimate based on imperfect and often conflicting data. In the case of the 1918 pandemic, the task was huge. The war had destroyed civil record systems across much of Europe. In many parts of the colonial world, the life and death of the native population was barely recorded, if at all. And everywhere, the disease itself confused the numbers. Thousands of deaths were officially blamed on bacterial pneumonia, which was often the finishing blow, without mention of the viral flu that had opened the door. The first estimates, made in the 1920s, put the death toll at around 21 million. It was a staggering figure, already higher than the military and civilian casualties of the First World War combined, but it was a gross underestimate. As historians and population experts have dug deeper into the records over the decades, reviewing census records, colonial reports, and burial registers, the figure has continued to climb chillingly. Today, the most conservative estimate places the death toll at 50 million people. Some higher estimates push it as far as 100 million. Consider that number for a moment. 50 million. In 1918, the world's population was about 1.8 billion people. This means the pandemic killed somewhere between 2.7% and 5.5% of the entire human species in little more than a year. It was the fastest and most brutal pruning of the human family tree in recorded history, far surpassing the Black Death of the 14th century in terms of absolute numbers. An estimated 1/3 of the world's population, some 500 million people, was infected. To put it in perspective, the First World War, with all its industrialized killing, killed about 15 to 20 million people, soldiers and civilians combined. The flu doubled, or perhaps quintupled, that in a fraction of the time, and with a silent efficiency no machine gun could ever match. The impact was not uniform. The virus acted with a selective cruelty, and the determining factor was not geography, but poverty, malnutrition, and a lack of infrastructure. In the developed nations of Europe and North America, the death rate was high but manageable, around 0.5% of the population. But in other parts of the world, the numbers reached apocalyptic levels. The epicenter of global death was British India. With a population already weakened by malnutrition and ruled by a colonial government that prioritized the war effort over public health, India was a killing field for the virus. An estimated 14 to 20 million Indians died, more than all the casualties of the First World War put together. Accounts from the time describe the rivers, especially the sacred Ganges, choked with the bodies of those whose families could not afford or did not have the strength to perform proper funeral rites. Funeral pyres burned day and night until the wood ran out. Entire villages were wiped out. In Persia, modern-day Iran, the situation was equally catastrophic. Caught between the British and Russian empires and suffering from a devastating famine, the flu found a population with no defences. Estimates suggest that between 10% and 25% of Iran's population died, a population blow from which the country would take decades to recover. Indigenous and isolated communities suffered disproportionately. With no prior exposure to similar flu strains, their immune systems had no defense whatsoever. In Alaska, some Inupiat native villages lost 85% to 90% of their population in a matter of days. In the Pacific Islands, the arrival of a single ship could mean a death sentence for an entire island. In Western Samoa, a territory under New Zealand's control, authorities carelessly allowed an infected ship to dock. In the following 2 months, 22% of the island's population died. Just a few miles away in American Samoa, a US naval governor, John Martin Poyer, put in place a strict and radical quarantine, allowing no ships to land. American Samoa did not record a single death from the flu. It was a brutal and perfect lesson in the power of public health. The population impact of this massive loss of life was deep and long-lasting. Global average life expectancy dropped. In the United States, it dropped by more than 12 years in 1918. The very structure of society shook. The peak death among young adults created a generation of orphans. It is estimated that in South Africa alone, 300,000 children were left without parents. In the United States, Philadelphia saw its orphan population triple. These children flooded underfunded orphanages or were raised by relatives already struggling to survive, carrying the scars of trauma for the rest of their lives. Economically, the pandemic caused massive disruption. Labor shortages affected agriculture and industry. Businesses closed. Fear kept people at home, paralyzing commerce. Yet, unlike a war, which destroys infrastructure, the pandemic destroyed only people. When it was over, the factories and farms were still there, waiting to be worked. This peculiarity, combined with huge post-war demand, may have contributed to the economic boom of the Roaring Twenties, though it was a boom built on a foundation of mass grief. Perhaps the strangest legacy of the 1918 pandemic was not what it did, but how it was remembered, or rather, how it was not. For decades, this population disaster was reduced to a footnote in the history of the First World War. There were no great monuments to the victims of the flu, no national days of remembrance. It became a kind of collective amnesia, a trauma so deep and personal that society preferred not to speak of it. Historians have proposed several reasons for this great forgetting. The war offered a story of heroism, sacrifice, and national victory. The pandemic offered none of that. Death by flu was lonely, inglorious, often happening in a darkened bedroom or a crowded hospital ward. There were no enemies to blame, no medals to be won. It was a private, familial tragedy, multiplied by millions. Moreover, people were simply exhausted. They wanted to forget the pain and move on, to embrace life in the new decade that lay before them. And so the story of the greatest plague in human history faded into the background, becoming a silent ghost in the memory of the 20th century, a hidden reminder that the greatest threat to humanity does not always come from the barrel of a gun, but sometimes from a simple microscopic breath. And then the noise stopped. Not at once, of course. The world took its time to empty its makeshift hospitals, to remove the canvas tents from the parks, to take apart the temporary morgues. But the noise of the pandemic itself, the constant chorus of coughs that had defined the sound of entire cities, faded away. It died down, town by town, home by home, until one day the world awoke to an almost deafening silence, a silence filled with absence. And what followed was perhaps the strangest chapter in this whole story, the forgetting, an act of collective amnesia so deep and so vast that it is almost as puzzling as the disease itself. For decades, the pandemic that had killed more people than the Great War itself was reduced to a footnote in the history books. A ghost barely whispered about in family memories. How is this possible? How can humanity erase from its awareness a disaster of such a scale? The answer, as always, is not simple. It is a coming together of trauma, convenience, and the very nature of the beast. First and above all, there was the shadow of the war. The First World War was a spectacular, visible trauma with a clear story. It had heroes and villains, defined battlefronts, medals, parades, and most importantly, monuments. The war was a man-made tragedy, and therefore it could be remembered by man. Triumphal arches were built. Rows of white crosses were planted in Flanders. Names were carved on bronze plaques. It was a sacrifice that could be understood, glorified, remembered. Humanity, it seems, prefers its disasters with uniforms and medals. The flu, by contrast, was an invisible, anonymous, faceless killer. It fought for no flag, nor for any ideal. It killed in the kitchen, in the bedroom, on the streetcar. Its battlefield was the interior of the human body. Its victims did not fall heroically on the field of honor. They drowned silently in their own beds, their lungs filled with fluid. No one built a monument to flu. No one erected a statue to the doctors and nurses who died simply for doing their jobs. The timeline itself was a crucial factor. The second and deadliest wave of the pandemic reached its peak in October and November of 1918, matching exactly with the final death throes of the war. On November 11th, 1918, when the armistice was signed and crowds poured into the streets of London, Paris and New York to celebrate, they did so wearing masks. Passing by carts collecting dead bodies, the joy of peace drowned out the cries of the sick. The world was desperate for a victory, for a happy ending, and the end of the war provided it. The ongoing pandemic was a story in convenience, a grim epilogue that no one wanted to read. The newspapers, finally freed from wartime censorship, dedicated their front pages to the peace negotiations in Versailles, to the redrawing of European borders, to the future. The virus, of course, did not read the newspapers. It continued its silent work while world leaders debated the fate of nations. President Woodrow Wilson himself fell gravely ill with it during the Paris Peace Conference in the spring of 1919, a fact that was downplayed and hidden, but which, according to historians like John M. Barry, may have severely affected his ability to negotiate, with consequences that changed the course of the 20th century. But even such a significant event was swept under the rug. The world wanted to move on, and move on it did. The trauma of the war and the pandemic gave way to an almost hysterical denial. The Roaring Twenties. It was a decade of deliberate frenzy, a loud party to drown out the echo of sirens and funeral bells. Jazz, flappers, illegal alcohol, the booming stock market. It was all a collective effort to look forward, to live fast and intensely, as if to make up for the lives that had been lost. To speak of the flu was in poor taste. It was to bring death to the party. It was a reminder of fragility, helplessness, and fear. In an era that wanted to celebrate strength, modernity, and a bulletproof optimism, families who had lost loved ones often did not speak of it. It was a private, often shameful death, one that did not fit into the bright new world being built on the ashes of the old. The trauma was not processed. It was simply pushed down. Finally, there was the nature of the disease itself. Unlike the Black Death, which left a permanent mark on medieval art, literature, and religion, the 1918 flu was swift and, in some ways, medically confusing. It attacked and retreated in waves in under 2 years. Scientists of the time were not even sure what caused it. Many still believed it was a bacteria, Pfeiffer's bacillus. They lacked the language and the tools to identify the true cause, a virus too small to be seen with the microscopes of the time. The lack of a clear enemy, of a solid scientific understanding, made the story harder to tell. There was no story of discovery or medical victory, only of survival and loss. And so, the greatest killer of the 20th century became a ghost, a family secret on a global scale. It would take decades and a new class of ghost hunters, armed with genetic tools, to finally bring the cause back from the grave and force it to tell its secrets. The silence could not last forever. The mystery was too great and the need to know too human. The hunt was about to begin. For nearly 80 years, the 1918 virus existed only as a ghost, a collection of statistical data, old brown photographs of hospital wards, and faded memories. The germ itself, the killer, had vanished from the face of the earth, or so it seemed. But in the world of science, No question is as tempting as an unsolved mystery, especially one with such a huge death toll. In the second half of the 20th century, a handful of scientists, driven by curiosity and a clear sense of urgency, started on one of the most extraordinary detective quests in history, the hunt for the 1918 virus. Their goal was quite literally to bring back a killer, not out of morbid curiosity, but to disarm it, to learn how to defeat its descendants. The first difficulty was huge. In 1918, virus science was in its infancy. Scientists could not isolate, grow, or even see the virus. Therefore, no laboratory samples of the original germ existed. If they wanted to find it, they would have to look for it where it had done its final work, in the bodies of its victims. The problem was that the virus, a fragile strand of RNA wrapped in protein, breaks down incredibly quickly after the host's death. Finding a viable sample after so many years was like searching for a needle in a haystack that, moreover, had broken down. The first serious clue pointed north to the extreme cold. Permafrost, the permanently frozen ground of the Arctic, acts as a natural freezer. The theory was simple. If a flu victim had been buried in the permafrost, it was possible that the virus had been preserved in their lung tissues. This idea caught the attention of a young and bold Swedish scientist named Johan Hultin. In 1951, while still a graduate student, Hultin organized an expedition to a remote Inupiaq village in Alaska called Brevig Mission. The place had been devastated by the pandemic. In just 5 days in November of 1918, the flu killed 72 of the village's 80 people. The bodies were hastily buried by the authorities in a mass grave marked by 2 white crosses in the frozen ground. Hultin, with the permission of the village elders, set to work. He describes the scene as surreal. He and his small team digging into the frozen tundra, the earth as hard as concrete under the midnight sun of the Arctic summer. Finally, about 2 meters down, they found the bodies, remarkably preserved by the ice. Hultin, working carefully, took lung tissue samples from 4 of the victims. His plan was to try to grow the live virus in fertilized chicken eggs, the standard technique of the time. He flew back to his laboratory in Iowa, full of hope. But the technology of 1951 was not up to the task. Despite his best efforts, the virus would not grow. The killer remained a ghost. Hultin had failed. He published his findings, preserved some of the tissue samples in formalin, and moved on with his career. The search, it seemed, had reached a dead end. Nearly 50 years passed. The world changed. Science went through a revolution. The discovery of the DNA double helix in 1953 opened the door to the era of molecular genetics. In the 1990s, a powerful new tool called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, allowed scientists to take tiny, broken fragments of genetic material and copy them millions of times, creating enough material to be studied. Suddenly, a live whole virus was no longer needed. Only its genetic remains, its molecular echo, were required. It was then that a new hunter entered the scene. Dr. Jeffrey Taubenberger, a molecular virus scientist at the United States Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. Taubenberger had a brilliant idea. His institute housed a vast archive of tissue, samples from military autopsies dating back to the Civil War. He thought that perhaps among the thousands of paraffin blocks containing pieces of organs from deceased soldiers, there might be one from a victim of the 1918 flu. And he found one, a lung sample from a 21-year-old soldier named Roscoe Vaughan, who died in September 1918 at a camp in South Carolina. The tissue was poorly preserved. The virus's RNA was in pieces, broken into tiny fragments. For years, Taubenberger and his team, including Dr. Ann Reed, worked carefully, like genetic archaeologists, extracting these fragments and trying to piece them together in the correct order. It was incredibly slow and frustrating work. It was like trying to rebuild an entire novel from a few scattered words found in confetti. In 1997, they achieved a breakthrough. They published the sequence of a handful of the virus's genes. The scientific world took notice. The hunt was on again. And this is where the story takes a movie-like turn. In San Francisco, a 72-year-old retired scientist read Taubenberger's article in the journal Science. His name was Johan Hultin, the very same Johan Hultin who had dug in the Alaskan permafrost nearly half a century earlier. He realized something crucial. Taubenberger's tissue was badly broken down, but he knew where to find much better samples. He knew exactly where the mass grave in Brevig Mission was. Without hesitation, Hultin picked up the phone and called Taubenberger. He explained who he was and made him an astonishing offer. He would return to Brevig mission at his own expense to get him better samples. And so in August of 1997, almost 50 years after his first attempt, Hultin, an energetic man in his 70s, flew to Alaska once more. Once again, he got the villagers' permission. He hired some local young people to help him dig. He remembered the exact spot. 4 days later, through the permafrost, they found a body. It was an Inupiaq woman whom Hultin, in an act of respect and personal connection, named Lucy. Lucy's body was remarkably well preserved. She was an obese woman, and her layer of body fat had acted as an additional insulator, protecting her internal organs from the cycle of freezing and thawing. Hultin, with the precision of a surgeon, opened her chest cavity and found the lungs. They were dark, congested, and filled with blood, just as the 1918 autopsies described. The virus had destroyed them. He took samples, placed them in preservatives, and sent them via priority mail to Taubenberger. 10 days later, Anne Reed, Taubenberger's colleague, called Hultin. She had news. The samples were perfect. The viral RNA was present in abundance, thanks to the determination of a retired scientist. They now had enough genetic material to rebuild the killer's entire genetic code. Over the next few years, Taubenberger's team, working in high-security laboratories, patiently read the 8 RNA segments that made up the 1918 virus's genetic code. Finally, in 2005, the work was complete. The ghost had a genetic face. And what did the virus's secrets reveal? The findings were chilling. It was confirmed to be an H1N1 virus of bird origin. But unlike most bird flu strains, which need to pass through an intermediate host like a pig to adapt to humans, this one appeared to have jumped directly from birds to people. It had gained a handful of key changes that allowed it not only to infect human cells, but to copy itself with terrifying speed and violence, especially deep within the lungs, a place the common seasonal flu rarely reaches. These changes, discovered thanks to the work of Hultin and Taubenberger, explained why the virus was so lethal. It triggered an immune response so massive and uncontrolled, the now famous cytokine storm, that the body's own defense system ended up destroying the lungs. The young and healthy, with their more strong immune systems, were often the most vulnerable victims. Their own strength became their weakness. The bringing back of the 1918 virus's genetic code was not just a scientific triumph, it was a warning. By identifying the molecular signatures that made this virus so deadly, scientists created a kind of genetic watch list. Now, if a new flu strain appears with some of these same characteristics, the alarms can sound much earlier. The hunt for the ghost of 1918 gave us a genetic treasure map to find its successors. The question that remained, a question that would become painfully relevant in the following decades, was whether the world, now armed with this knowledge, would be able to read the map in time. Because the story of the Spanish flu is not just a story of virus science and amnesia. It is above all a story of lessons, lessons offered at a high price and all too often not learned. The legacy of the 1918 pandemic is a paradox. On one hand, it was a silent catalyst for deep changes in medicine and public health. On the other, it is the perfect example of humanity's tendency for selective amnesia, for stumbling over the same stone again and again. To look back at the ashes of 1918 is to see the unsettling echoes of our own present. A reminder that while our technology has advanced by leaps and bounds, our collective psychology, our political responses, and our basic vulnerabilities have changed very little. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, there was a recognition, at least in medical and government circles, that something had failed catastrophically. The crisis exposed the fragility of public health systems around the world. This led to the creation or strengthening of health departments in many countries. In Europe, the health organization of the League of Nations was established, a forerunner to the World Health Organization. Epidemiology, once a somewhat obscure discipline, became a cornerstone of modern medicine. An understanding began to dawn about the importance of global disease surveillance, data collection, and the need for an organized response. In a way, the world of modern public health was born from the trauma of 1918. It was recognized that a microbe in one part of the world could become a problem for everyone, a lesson that the connectedness of the jet age and global trade would make even more relevant. However, these institutional lessons often failed to reach public awareness or long-term political will. The memory faded, and with it the sense of urgency. And it is here that the echoes become louder and more disturbing. Take, for example, non-pharmaceutical public health measures, so-called social distancing. In 1918, with no vaccines or antivirals, cities turned to the same tools we have seen in the 21st century, closing schools, theatres, and public places, banning mass gatherings, mandatory use of gauze masks, and the results from back then offer a perfect case study that remains relevant today. The story of two American cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis, has become a textbook example. Philadelphia, despite warnings, went ahead with a massive parade to raise funds for the war. Within days, the city was flooded with cases, and its death rate was one of the highest in the country. St. Louis, by contrast, put in place social distancing measures early and aggressively. Its death rate was less than half of Philadelphia's. The lesson was clear. Swift, decisive action saves lives. And yet, over a century later, we have seen the same debate, the same hesitations, the same tension between the economy and public health repeated in cities across the globe. The debate over masks is another astonishing echo. In 1918, mask orders were common in many cities, especially in the American West. And just like today, they generated resistance. Anti-mask leagues were formed, like the one in San Francisco, where citizens protested, arguing that the laws infringed upon their personal freedoms and that the effectiveness of masks was unproven. The newspapers of the time are filled with stories of people being fined or arrested for not wearing a mask, and of public debates about their usefulness. The technology has changed, but the conversation about individual responsibility versus the collective good is virtually identical. Misinformation and the search for miracle. Cures also flourished in the fertile ground of fear and uncertainty. In 1918, people clung to all sorts of unproven remedies, from wearing camphor bags around their necks to eating onions or gargling with disinfectants. Advertisements of the era promoted tonics and elixirs that promised to protect against the flu. One common and tragically misguided treatment was the use of massive doses of aspirin, a relatively new drug at the time. Doctors, not knowing what else to do, sometimes prescribed doses we would now consider toxic, which may have contributed to some of the deaths by causing lung bleeding. If you swap aspirin and camphor for hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin and newspaper ads for viral social media posts, the pattern is eerily familiar. The technology for spreading misinformation has become infinitely more efficient, but the human desire to find a simple, quick solution to a complex and terrifying problem has not changed at all. Perhaps the grimmest echo is that of nationalism and the lack of international cooperation. The pandemic was named the Spanish flu, not because it started in Spain, but because Spain, being a neutral country in the war, did not censor its press. While the warring nations suppressed news of the outbreak so as not to harm morale, Spanish newspapers reported freely on the disease, creating the false impression that it was the epicenter. This act of blaming an other is a reflex we have seen repeated with every new outbreak. The 1918 pandemic was made worse by a world fractured by war, where information was not shared and each nation was primarily concerned with itself. A century later, despite the existence of global health organizations and unprecedented connectedness, we have seen borders close. Countries compete for resources like ventilators or vaccines, and nationalist rhetoric seeking scapegoats rather than collaborative solutions. The lesson that a pandemic is a global problem requiring a global solution is perhaps the hardest lesson to learn. Finally, the relevance of 1918 is not merely symbolic, it is biological. The H1N1 virus of 1918 never truly disappeared. It weakened, changed, and became the strain of seasonal flu that circulated for decades. And its genes continued to recombine with other bird and swine flu viruses, giving rise to the later pandemics of the 20th century, such as the 1957 Asian flu, H2N2, and the 1968 Hong Kong flu, H3N2, both of them distant genetic descendants of the 1918 monster. Even the 2009 swine flu pandemic was caused by a new variant of H1N1, a great-great-grandchild of the original virus. The ghost is not just in our history books. It is still alive in a literal sense, in the genetic code of the viruses that infect us today. The story of the Great Pandemic is, in the end, a cautionary tale. It is a mirror that shows us that our technological sophistication often masks a primitive fragility. It teaches us that memory is a muscle that must be exercised, or it weakens. It reminds us that the most important lessons are not learned from successes, but from the most catastrophic failures. The 1918 pandemic was neither the beginning nor the end of the long and bloody war between humanity and microbes. It was simply the most devastating battle to date. A battle whose lessons are written on millions of forgotten gravestones, waiting patiently for us to finally be ready to read them and to remember them before the silence falls again.